Hello everyone and welcome back to the Mr. Night Shadow. Now I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relaxed and let's begin. I never thought selling my old car on Craigslist would turn into the most terrifying experience of my life. I was just trying to make some extra cash to help pay off some bills. My old Honda Civic had served me well for years, but it was time to let it go. I posted an ad, added some pictures, and waited for interested buyers to contact me. It didn't take long before I got a message from a guy named Jeff. He seemed really interested, asking all horizon questions about the car. We exchanged a few emails and he asked if he could come by to take a look. Everything seemed normal. I agreed and gave him my address. Jeff showed up the next afternoon. He was in his late 30s, clean shaven, and wore a friendly smile. We made small talk as he inspected the car and everything felt fine. He seemed genuinely interested, even asked to take it for a test drive. I didn't think twice and handed him the keys. He suggested we drive to a nearby parking lot to get a better feel for the car. Again, this didn't seem odd. I agreed and got in the passenger seat. As we drove, he kept up the friendly chatter, asking about my job, my interests, and other casual topics, but something about the way he was driving started to feel off. He wasn't driving like someone who was testing a car. He was driving with a purpose, like he knew exactly where he was going. We pulled into an abandoned lot on the outskirts of town. Mick had told me something was wrong, but before I could say anything, he stopped the car and turned to me with a different look in his eyes. The friendly demeanor was gone, replaced by something cold and calculating. Get out, he said, his voice low and menacing. My heart raced as I realized I was trapped. I fumbled for the door handle, but he grabbed my arm, yanking me back. "You're not going anywhere," he hissed. I tried to scream, but he slapped his hand over my mouth, muffling the sound. Panic surged through me. I had to think fast. I bit down hard on his hand and he yelled in pain, loosening his just enough for me to push the door open and stumble out. I ran as fast as I could. Now looking back, my heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. I could hear him cursing behind me, but I didn't stop. I sprinted toward the main road, praying that someone would be there to help. Miraculously, a car was approaching. I waved frantically and the driver, an older woman, stopped and rolled down her window. "Help me," I screamed. "Please, please help me." She must have seen the terror in my eyes because she unlocked the door without hesitation. I jumped in and she sped off, leaving Jeff standing in the dust. I explained what had happened between gasps for breath, and she took me straight to the nearest police station. The police took my statement and assured me they'd investigate. They took the details of Jeff's description and the messages we exchanged. They also promised to search the abandoned lot where he had taken me. Days passed and I couldn't shake the fear that GPT me every time I heard a car pull up outside my house. I panicked. The police eventually called me with an update. They found my car in the lot, but Jeff was nowhere to be found. They said he was likely a serial carjacker who had lured other unsuspecting sellers into similar traps. Knowing he was still out there haunted me. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything. I had nightmares of him finding me, finishing what he started. The police promised to keep looking, but they admitted it would be difficult without more leads. I changed my phone number, moved to a new apartment, and tried to get on with my life, but the fear stayed with me. Every time I went outside, I felt like someone was watching. I never sold anything on Craigslist again, and I warned everyone I knew to be careful. Eventually, the police caught Jeff. He had tried to pull the same stunt on another victim, but this time they were ready for him. They arrested him and charged him with multiple counts of carjacking and attempted kidnapping. Hearing the news brought some relief, but the experience changed me. I had been looking for a vintage guitar for a while, something with character and a bit of history. Craigslist seemed like a good place to start, so I spent a few evenings browsing through ads. One night, I found a listing that caught my eye, a beautiful 1960s Gibson, reasonably priced. I contacted the seller immediately. The guy's name was Rick. He responded quickly and we arranged to meet at a coffee shop in Austin. When I got there, Rick was already waiting, guitar in hand. He seemed friendly enough, a bit rough around the edges but nothing too alarming. The guitar was in great condition, just as the ad had described. We chatted for a bit, and after some negotiation I handed over the cash and took the guitar. As I was leaving, Rick asked if I lived nearby. I mentioned I was just a few miles away in an attempt to make small talk. He nodded and said he hoped I enjoyed the guitar. I thought nothing of it and went on my way. When I got home, I couldn't wait to play. The guitar sounded amazing, even better than I had hoped. I spent the next few hours lost in music, completely forgetting about the world outside. It was late when I finally put the guitar down and decided to call it a night. As I was getting ready for bed, I heard a noise outside. It sounded like someone was moving around near my driveway. I peeked through the blinds and saw a shadowy figure near my car. My heart started racing. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal or maybe a neighbor, but deep down I knew something was wrong. I turned off all the lights and stayed quiet, watching the figure. After a few minutes, the person moved closer to the house. I could see them more clearly now. It was Rick. He was trying to look through the windows, checking if anyone was home. Panic set in. I cracked my phone and dialed 911, whispering to the operator about the intruder. They told me to stay calm and stay on the line until the police arrived. Rick started to move towards the back door, jiggling the handle. I could hear him cursing under his breath. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't get in. The minutes felt like hours. Then I heard sirens in the distance. Rick must have heard them too, because he bolted, running back towards the street. I stayed on the line until the police arrived, explaining everything to them as best as I could. The officers searched the area but didn't find Rick. They took my statement and assured me they would patrol the neighborhood for the next few nights. They advised me to keep my doors and windows locked and to call them if I saw anything suspicious. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every little noise made me jump. I decided to take some time off work and stay with a friend for a few days. I didn't feel safe at home while I was away. I got a call from the police. They had caught Rick. Apparently, he had tried to pull the same stunt on someone else, but this time the person fought back and managed to detain him until the cops arrived. They found several stolen items in his possession, including a few guitars. Hearing this brought some relief, but I still felt uneasy. I went back home, changed all the locks, and installed a security system. It took a while to feel comfortable in my own house again. The experience left me shaken, but it also made me more cautious. From then on, I was careful about who I dealt with, especially online. I never met strangers alone, always choosing public places with lots of people around. The guitar, as beautiful as it was, became a reminder of that terrifying night. I kept it, but every time I played I couldn't help but think about how close I came to real danger. In the end, I was lucky I got out safe and Rick was caught. I had this old dining S I wanted to sell. It was too big for my apartment, and I needed the space for our home office, so I listed it on a local classified website. Within a day, I got a message from a guy named Tom. He seemed nice enough, said he was moving into a new place and needed some furniture. We acre on a price, and he asked if he could come by to see it. I wasn't too worried about having him over. It was broad daylight and my neighborhood was usually pretty safe. When he showed up, Tom looked pretty normal, mid-30s, well-dressed, polite. We chatted a bit about the dining set and he seemed genuinely interested. He asked if he could see the rest of my apartment to get an idea of the space it might fit in. I felt a bit uneasy but didn't want to seem rude, so I agreed. As we walked around, he made small talk, asked about my job, how long I'd live there, stuff like that. It seemed harmless, but something about his questions felt off. He lingered a bit too long in certain rooms, looking around more than necessary. After a while, he said he liked the dining set and would get back to me about buying it. I felt relieved when he left, but the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. There was something in his eyes, a calculating look that I couldn't shake off. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the visit in my head, thinking about the way he had looked at my apartment. I started to worry he wasn't just interested in the furniture. The next day, I decided to call him and tell him the set was no longer for sale, but he didn't answer. I left a message trying to sound casual. A couple of days passed and I started to relax. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Then one night I heard a noise outside. It was around midnight and my neighborhood was usually dead quiet at that hour. I got out of bed and Listen there, it was again a faint scraping sound like someone was trying to pry open a window. My heart started pounding. I crept to the living room and peed through the blinds. In the darkness, I could make out a figure crouch by the side of my apartment near one of the windows. I couldn't see his face, but I knew it was Tom. Panic set in. I cracked my phone and dialed 911, whispering to the operator that someone was trying to break into my home. The operator told me to stay on the line and stay quiet. I did my best to keep calm, but my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. The scraping noise stopped, and for a moment everything was silent. Then I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving around to the back of the apartment. I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't have a back door, just a small window in the kitchen that led to the fire escape. I moved as quietly as I could to the kitchen and peeked out. Tom was there, trying to force open the window. I ducked down, my breath coming in short, terrified gasps. The operator assured me the police were on their way, but it felt like an eternity. I heard a loud crash and realized Tom had broken the window. I had to do something. I grabbed a heavy frying pan and stood near the kitchen door, my heart hammering in my chest. I could hear him climbing through the window, muttering to himself. Just as he was about to step into the kitchen, I heard sirens in the distance. Tom froze. The sirens got louder and I heard the sound of car doors slamming. Tom cursed and scrambled back out the window. I stayed hidden until I heard the police shouting for him to stop. Minutes later, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find two officers standing there. They had Tom in handcuffs. One of the officers explained that they had caught him trying to run. They found a bag in his car with tools for breaking and entering, along with a list of addresses. Mine was at the top. I gave my statement to the police, explaining everything that had happened. They assured me Tom would be charged and that I would be safe. It was a long night, and even after the police left, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how close I had come to being a victim. In the days that followed, I installed better locks and got a security system. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but gradually the fear started to fade. I found this old bookstore downtown in Denver. It was one of those places that looked like it hadn't changed in 50 years. Dusty shelves, creaky floors, and the smell of old paper. I loved it. I was hunting for a rare book I'd heard about, an obscure crime novel from the 1930s. I didn't really expect to find it, but I figured it was worth a shot. The owner was this old guy named Mr. Harris. He was friendly enough, and after chatting for a bit, he led me to a back room. It was darker back there, with stacks of books that looked like they hadn't been touched in ages. After some digging, he pulled out the book. It was exactly what I was looking for. I bought it and headed home, excited to start reading. The book was fascinating, a gritty story about crime and corruption, but something felt off as I flipped through the pages. I noticed some strange markings. They were small, almost hidden in the margins. At first I thought they were just random scribble, but the more I looked, the more I realized they formed a pattern. I spent hours studying the markings. It felt like a puzzle, and eventually I figured out there were some kind of code. I deciphered it, and what I found was shocking. The book wasn't just a novel, it was a record of real crimes. There were names, dates, locations, all pointing to a crime syndicate operating in Denver. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to go to the police, but I didn't know if I could trust them. What if they were involved? I decided to keep digging. Maybe I could find more clues, something that could expose the syndicate without putting myself in danger. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It started with little things: a car parked outside my apartment for 2 long, strangers giving me odd looks. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the feeling wouldn't go away. One night, I was heading home from work when I noticed a man following me. He was dressed in dark clothes and kept a distance, but I knew he was watching me. I took a few detours trying to lose him, but he stayed on my trail. I finally made it to my apartment and locked the door behind me, my heart racing. I peeked out the window and saw him standing across the street, staring up at my building. I called a friend, told them what was happening, and asked if I could stay at their place for a few days. They agreed, and I packed a bag, trying to calm my nerves. The next day, I went back to the bookstore to see Mr. Harris. I needed to know if he was aware of the book's hidden contents. When I arrived, the shop was closed. A for sale sign hung in the window. It didn't make sense. I had just been there a few days ago, and there was no mention of it. Closing down, I asked around the neighborhood, but no one knew what had happened to Mr. Harris. It was like he had vanished overnight. I was starting to feel like I was in over my ad. The more I dug, the more dangerous it became. That night in my friend's place, I heard a noise outside. It was a soft scraping, like someone was trying to pick the lock. I grabbed a kitchen knife and crept to the door. The noise stopped and I heard footsteps retreating. I looked through the people but saw nothing. The next morning I found a note slipped under the door. It was a warning telling me to stop looking into the book or there would be consequences. My friend was terrified and told me to go to the police. I knew I had to, but I was still scared they might be involved. I decided to take a chance and went to the local precinct. I asked to speak to a detective and told him everything. To my relief, he seemed genuinely concerned and agreed to help. He took the book and promised to look into it. For a few days, things seemed to calm down. I stayed with my friend, trying to return to some sense of normalcy, but then I got a call from the detective he wanted to meet in person. Said he had found something important. We met at a diner downtown. He looked nervous, glancing around like he was being watched. He slid a file across the table to me. Inside were documents and photos, evidence that tied the book to real crimes. But there was also something else, a list of names, including high-ranking officials and law enforcement. The detective told me we were in serious danger. The syndicate had people everywhere and they would stop at nothing to get the book back. He said we needed to go into hiding, that he had a safe place where we could stay until it was safe to come out. We left the diner separately, trying to avoid drawing attention. I followed his instructions, meeting him at a remote cabin outside the city. It was isolated, surrounded by woods, a perfect place to lay low for a while. It seemed like we were safe, but then one night I woke up to the sound of cars approaching. The detective burst into my room telling me to grab my things and run. The syndicate had found us. We bolted into the woods, the sound of footsteps and shouting behind us. I could barely see, my heart pounding in my chest. We ran for what felt like hours until we stumbled upon an old abandoned shack. We hid inside, trying to catch our breath. The detective whispered that we needed to keep moving, but we were trapped. We heard them outside searching the area. It was only a matter of time before they found us. The detective pulled out his gun, ready to defend us. Just as they were about to break in, we heard sirens. The real police had arrived, tipped off by a friend of the detective. There was a shootout, and after what felt like an eternity, it was over. The syndicate members were arrested and we were safe. The detective and I were taken back to the city where we gave our statements. The evidence from the book led to a massive investigation, bringing down the crime syndicate and exposing the corrupt officials. It was a terrifying experience, but in the end, justice was served. I bought the laptop from a guy on Craigslist. My old one had crashed and I needed a replacement fast for work. The guy seemed normal enough, a little nervous maybe, but he handed it over with no issues. I got home, booted it up, and everything seemed fine. It was only later that night, while I was going through the files, that I found something strange. There was a folder hidden deep in the system. It didn't have a name, just a string of random characters. I almost ignored it, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside were hundreds of files, videos, documents, images. It didn't take long to realize they were all illegal, horrific stuff. I shut the laptop, heart pounding. I decided to call the police, but first I needed some air. I walked out onto my balcony, trying to calm down. That's when I noticed a car parked across the street. It was the same car the guy had driven when he sold me the laptop. The hairs on my neck stood up. Was he watching me? I went back inside and called 911. I told them everything about the laptop and the files. They said someone would come over right away. I stayed near the window, keeping an eye on the car. It hadn't moved. Minutes later, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to two officers. I showed them the laptop and the files. They took it seriously, which was a relief. One of the officers took the laptop while the other stayed with me, asking questions. Suddenly there was a loud crash from the front door. The officer with me drew his weapon and told me to stay put. I heard shouting followed by gunshots. The officer guarding me told me to hide. I ducked into the bathroom, trembling. After what felt like hours, the noise stopped. The officer came to get me. The other officer was down and the guy from Craigslist was dead. It turns out he had been watching me, and when he saw the cops, he panicked. The police took my statement and assured me they handle Everything. I stayed with a friend that night, too scared to be alone the next day. They contacted me to say the files on the laptop were part of a larger investigation. The guy had been involved in some serious criminal activities. I was relieved it was over, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I moved to a new apartment hoping a change of scenery would help. It took a while, but life started to feel normal again. I got a new laptop, this time from a store. I still think about that night sometimes, especially when I see a car parked too long outside my building. I decided to sell my motorcycle. It wasn't anything fancy, but I needed the money. I put up an ad on Craigslist and waited. It didn't take long for someone to respond. His name was Mike, and he seemed like a nice enough guy. We exchanged a few emails, and he agreed to come over and take a look. Mike showed up right on time. He was a tall guy with a friendly smile. We chatted a bit about the bike, and he seemed genuinely interested. After a short test ride, he agreed to buy it. He handed me the cash, and I gave him the keys and the title. Everything seemed fine, and I was relieved. The sale went smoothly. A few days later, I started getting strange texts from Mike. He said the bike wasn't running properly and accused me of selling him a lemon. I apologized and told him it had always worked fine for me. He didn't seem satisfied and kept sending messages. The tone of his texts got angrier, and he started accusing me of scamming him. I tried to ignore the texts, hoping he would give up, but then I started noticing a car parked outside my apartment building. It was there every night, and I had a feeling it was Mike. One evening as I was walking home from work, I saw the car again. This time I saw Mike sitting inside, staring right at me. My heart and I quickly went inside, locking the door behind me. The texts from Mike continued, becoming more threatening. He said he knew where I lived and that he would make me pay. I decided to call the police. They took my report, but said there wasn't much they could do unless he actually did something that didn't make me feel any safer. The next night, I heard noises outside my window. I peeked through the blinds and saw Mike in my yard looking around. I called the police again, and this time they arrived quickly. They found Mike in my yard and questioned him. He claimed he was just there to talk to me about the bike. The police warned him to stay away from me and let him go. I thought that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. The following evening, I came home to find my front door slightly open. My stomach dropped. I cautiously stepped inside and saw that my place had been trashed. Trays were pulled out, papers scattered everywhere. I called the police again, and they came to investigate. I told them about Mike, but they couldn't find any evidence linking him to the break-in. I was terrified. I couldn't stay there anymore, so I packed a bag and went to stay with a friend. For the next few days I lived in fear, constantly looking over my shoulder. I didn't hear from Mike, and the car outside my apartment was gone. I started to relax, thinking maybe he had given up. One night while staying in my friend's place, I woke up to a noise outside the window. I crept over and looked out. There was Mike staring right at me. I felt a wave of panic. I woke my friend and we called the police. They arrived quickly and caught Mike trying to break in. This time they arrested him. Mike was charged with stalking and attempted burglary. I had to testify in court, which was terrifying, but I was relieved when he was sentenced to jail time. After the trial, I moved to a new apartment and changed my phone number. It took a while, but I finally started to feel safe again. Looking back, I can't believe how quickly things escalated. I never expected selling a motorcycle could lead to something so terrifying. I've learned to be more cautious with transactions like that and to trust my instincts if something feels off. I was living in Chicago with my baby daughter Emma. Money was tight, so I turned to Craigslist to find a secondhand stroller. After a bit of searching, I found one that looked perfect and was within my budget. I contacted the seller, a woman named Susan, and we arranged to meet at her apartment. Susan's place was in a rougher part of town, but she seemed friendly enough. She showed me the stroller, which was in great condition. We chatted a bit about our kids, and she even gave me some baby clothes her daughter had grown. I paid her, thanked her, and headed home feeling relieved to have found such a good deal. That night, I got a message from Susan asking if I got home safely. It seemed a bit odd, but I replied that I had and thanked her again. Over the next few days, I noticed a car parked across the street from my apartment. It was always there, and I started feeling uneasy. One evening as I was putting Emma to bed, I heard a noise outside my window. I looked out and saw a man standing by the car staring up at my apartment. I quickly closed the blinds and called my friend Lisa. She offered to come over and stay with me, but I told her it was probably nothing. The next day I went to the grocery store, and when I came out I saw the same car parked near mine. The man was sitting inside watching me. My heart raced as I hurried to my car, locked the doors, and drove home as fast as I could. I knew something was very wrong that night. I heard noises outside my window again. I peeked through the blinds and saw two men in my yard. They were trying to break into my car. I cracked my phone and called the police. They arrived quickly, but the men were gone by the time they got there. The officers took my report court and promised to patrol the area more often. The next day, I got a text from an unknown number. It said, "We know where you live. Don't call the cops again." I was terrified. I called Lisa and told her everything. She insisted I'd come stay with her for a while. I packed a bag for Emma and me, and we left that night at Lisa's place. I felt a bit safer, but I couldn't chase the feeling of being watched. I didn't hear from Susan again, but I kept getting threatening texts from different numbers. I changed my phone number, but somehow they kept finding it. I knew I needed to do something. I went to the police again and told them everything. They took me seriously this time and assigned a detective to my case. He suggested I stay somewhere else for a while and promised to look into Susan and the men who had been stalking me. Lisa and I decided to go to her parents' cabin in Wisconsin. It was remote and felt like a safe place to hide. We stayed there for a few weeks trying to get back to some sense of normalcy. The detective called me regularly with updates, but they hadn't found the men yet. One night I woke up to the sound of a car outside the cabin. I looked out and saw the same car that had been parked outside my apartment. Panic set in as I grabbed Emma and Lisa. We called the police and hid in the bathroom waiting for help to arrive. The police showed up and caught one of the men trying to break into the cabin. They arrested him, and after questioning him they found out that Susan was part of a gang that used Craigslist to find new victims. They would lure people in with good deals, then target them for robbery or worse. With the information from the arrested man, the police were able to track down the rest of the game, including Susan. They were all arrested and charged with multiple crimes. It was a long and stressful process, but I was relieved when they were finally behind bars. I moved to a new apartment in a different part of the city and took extra precautions to ensure our safety. I decided to sell my old camera equipment to make some extra cash. I posted an ad on Craigslist and got a response almost immediately. The guy seemed legit, said he was a student who needed a good camera for his photography class. We agreed to meet in a busy coffee shop in Midtown Manhattan. When I arrived, I saw a young guy, maybe in his early 20s, sitting at a table with a backpack. He waved me over and introduced himself as Mike. He was polite, asked me about the camera and why I was selling it. I explained that I had upgraded to a new model and didn't need this one anymore. Mike examined the camera carefully, asking all the right questions. He seemed genuinely interested and knowledgeable. We talked for a bit and he offered to buy it for the price I had listed. I was relieved. It had been sitting in my closet for months. Mike then suggested we grab a coffee while he transferred the money via an app. One agreed and we went to the counter. He ordered 2 lattes and we sat back down. As we waited, he kept the conversation going, talking about his photography projects and school. It was all very normal and I didn't suspect anything. When our drinks arrived, I took a sip of mine. It tasted a bit off, but I didn't think much of it. We continued chatting, but soon I started to feel dizzy, my vision blurred, and I struggled to keep my eyes open. The last thing I remember was Mike's face, looking concerned, asking if I was okay. I woke up in a dark alley, lying on the ground. My head was pounding and I felt nauseous. My pockets were empty. My wallet, phone, and keys were gone. The camera, of course, was also missing. I struggled to my feet, trying to piece together what had happened. Stumbling out of the alley, I made my way to the nearest street. I flagged down a cab and asked the driver to take me to the nearest police station. At the station, I reported the robbery, describing Mike and everything that had happened. The officers were sympathetic, but said it would be tough to track him down without more information. Feeling helpless, I asked to use their phone to call a friend. My friend, Jenny, came to pick me up. She was shocked and worried, insisting I go to the hospital. At the hospital, they confirmed I had been drugged, probably with something slipped into my drink over the next few days. I tried to follow up with the police, but there was no progress. Mike had disappeared without a trace. I felt violated and paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder, fearing he might come back for more. The thought that he had planned everything so meticulously made it even worse. I spent hours online looking for any information on similar incidents, hoping to find a clue. I found forums and articles about people getting scammed and robbed through Craigslist, but nothing that matched my experience. Exactly, it seemed like Mike was a PRL and I was just another one of his victims. Despite the police's lack of leads, I refused to give up. I went back to the coffee shop, asking the staff if they remembered anything unusual about Mike. One of the baristas recalled him coming in a few times before, always alone, always sitting at the same table. It was a small lead, but it was something. I convinced the manager to let me look at their security footage. It took some convincing, but eventually he agreed. We spent hours going through the tapes, and finally we found a clear shot of Mike's face. I took a screenshot with my friend's phone and brought it back to the police. With the photo, the police were able to start a more thorough investigation. They put out a bulletin with Mike's picture, hoping someone would recognize him. Weeks passed, and I heard nothing. I tried to move on, but it was hard. Every time I saw a young guy with a backpack, my heart would race. One night, I got a call from the police. They had arrested a suspect matching Mike's description. I went down to the station and confirmed it was him. They found my camera and some of my other belongings in his apartment. It was a small victory, but it didn't erase the fear and violation I felt. Mike was charged with multiple counts of robbery in drugging his victims. During his trial, it came out that he had done this to several other people. Knowing I wasn't alone didn't make me feel any better, but at least he was off the streets. Even though he was caught, the experience left a lasting impact. I became more cautious, more suspicious of strangers. Selling the camera had seemed like a simple, harmless transaction, but it turned into a nightmare. I stopped using Craigslist and stuck to safer, more secure methods for buying and selling things. Living in a big city like New York, you think you're prepared for anything, but this showed me how vulnerable we can all be. I had been searching for a unique piece of jewelry for months, something special that I could wear on my birthday. After browsing countless stores and websites, I found a beautiful necklace on Craigslist. It was a vintage piece, gold with a delicate design, and the price was surprisingly reasonable. The seller, a woman named Karen, seemed polite and responsive. Through our emails, we arranged to meet at a cafe in downtown Phoenix. The cafe was busy when I arrived, bustling with people enjoying their Saturday morning coffee. Karen was already there, sitting at a table near the window. She looked normal, mid-30s, dressed casually. We exchanged pleasantries, and she handed me the necklace. It was even more beautiful in person, and I couldn't believe my luck. After a bit of small talk, I handed her the cash, and she left with a friendly wave. Feeling thrilled with my purchase, I wore the necklace that evening. It drew compliments from friends at my birthday dinner, and I felt a special connection to it. Over the next few days, I noticed a few strange things. Once I thought I saw someone following me while I was out shopping. Another time, my car alarm went off in the middle of the night, but there was no sign of forced entry. I dismissed these incidents as coincidences, not thinking they were related. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a noise outside my apartment window. I lived on the ground floor, and the sound was distinct, like someone trying to open the window. My heart raced, and I cracked my phone to call the police. Before I could dial, the noise stopped. I peed through the blinds, but saw nothing. It took me hours to fall asleep, my mind racing with possibilities. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to stay home from work and keep an eye on my apartment. Around noon, I saw a man loitering across the street. He was wearing a hoodie and sunglasses, standing too casually for too long. I watched him from behind the curtains, and after what felt like forever, he walked away. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid, but the fear lingered. That evening, I received a message from an unknown number. It said, "Enjoying the necklace." My blood ran cold. How did they know? I replied, asking who it was, but got no response. I decided to call Tarun, thinking maybe she had given my number to someone. The phone rang, but no one answered. I left a message explaining the situation and asking her to call me back hours later, I heard her knock on my door. It was Tarun. She looked different, more anxious than the cheerful woman I met at the cafe. She said she needed to talk. I let her in and she immediately asked if anyone had contacted me about the necklace. I showed her the message and she sighed, looking terrified. Tarun explained that the necklace wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it belonged to a dangerous man she had once been involved with. She stole it from him to escape their relationship and sold it to me to cover our tracks. Now it seemed he had found out and was coming after both of us. My fear turned into panic as she spoke, realizing the danger I was in. We decided to go to the police. At the station we explained everything from the sale of the necklace to the threatening message. The officers took our statement seriously and advised us to stay somewhere safe. They would investigate, but there was no guarantee they could catch the man quickly. Tarun and I left the station feeling a bit more secure but still on edge. She suggested we stay at her friend's place out of town for a few days. We packed our essentials and drove to our friend's house, a small secluded place in the desert. The isolation was eerie, but we felt safer away from the city. The first night was restless. Every sound outside made us jump. In the morning we discussed our next steps. Karen remembered a safe deposit box where she had hidden some documents that might help the police track down her ex. We decided to retreat them despite the risk. Driving back to the city we were cautious, checking for anyone following us. At the bank Karen retrieved the documents without issue. As we left I noticed a familiar figure in the parking lot, the man in Nye. My heart pounded as we hurried back to the car and sped off. Back at the house we handed the documents to the police. They assured us they would use them to locate the man and urged us to stay hidden that night. The isolation of the desert felt more like a prison. We barely slept, every creak and CRW of the house setting us on edge. Early the next morning we were jolted awake by the sound of breaking glass. He had found us. We ran to the back door, but he was already inside, his face twisted with rage. Karen screamed and I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy lamp, and swung it at him. He staggered but didn't fall. In the chaos Karen managed to grab her phone and call 911. We barricaded ourselves in a bedroom, pushing furniture against the door. He pounded on it, shouting threats. The minutes felt like hours until we heard the distant wail of sirens. The man's shouts turned to curses and then silence. We stayed put, trembling, until we heard the police announcing themselves. They found him hiding in the house and arrested him. The officers escorted us out, assuring us we were safe. Now the relief was overwhelming, but the trauma of the experience lingered. Tarun and I decided to part ways for our safety. I moved to a different apartment, changed my number, and tried to rebuild my sense of security. Months later, I still have the necklace, a reminder of the ordeal. I needed some extra cash, so I decided to rent out my spare room. Craigslist seemed like the easiest option, so I posted an ad with some photos of the place. It wasn't long before I got a response from a guy named Mark. He seemed polite enough in his emails, so we arranged a time for him to come check out the apartment. When Mark showed up, he seemed normal enough. He was in his mid-30s, dressed casually, and he asked all right questions about the rent and utilities. I showed him around the place, and he seemed impressed. He said he was near to Boston and needed a place to stay while he got settled in the city. I didn't see any red flags, so I agreed to rent the room to him. We signed the lease, and he moved in a few days later. At first everything seemed fine. Mark teed to himself mostly, and we didn't interact much beyond the occasional nod in the hallway. But as the weeks went by, I started to notice some strange things about Mark. He would come and go at odd hours, sometimes in the middle of the night. He also had a habit of bringing strange people over to the apartment, shady-looking characters who would come and go without saying much. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it wasn't any of my business as long as he paid the rent on time. But then things started to escalate. One night I heard shouting coming from Mark's room. I went to investigate, and I could hear him arguing with someone on the phone. He sounded angry, almost desperate. The next morning I found a note slipped under my door. It was from Mark, apologizing for the noise and explaining that he had been dealing with some personal issues. I felt bad for him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. A few days later I came home from work to find the apartment Ransacked Torres were pulled out, furniture overturned, and my valuables were missing. I panicked thinking I had been robbed, but then I remembered Mark. I rushed to his room, but he was gone. I called the police and explained what had happened. They took a report but said there wasn't much they could do without any evidence. I felt violated and angry, knowing that I had let a criminal into my home. Weeks went by, and I heard nothing from Mark. I tried to move on with my life, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Then one night I heard a knock on my door. It was Mark. He looked different, disheveled and panicked. He begged me to let him in, saying he was being chased by some dangerous people. I hesitated, torn between wanting to help him and fearing for my own safety, but then I saw the fear in his eyes and I knew I had to do something. I let him in and listened as he explained what had happened. He had gotten mixed up with some bad people, he said, and now they were after him. He didn't have anywhere else to go, and he begged me to help him hide. I didn't know what to do. On one hand, I felt sorry for Mark and wanted to help him. On the other hand, I knew that harboring a fugitive was a serious crime. I debated with myself for what felt like hours, but in the end I couldn't turn him away. I helped Mark hide out in my apartment, keeping a low profile and avoiding any contact with the outside world. I was terrified that the people after him would find out he was here and come after. Both of his days turned into weeks, and still Mark stayed hidden in my apartment. I tried to go about my life as usual, but the constant fear weighed heavily on me. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think about anything other than the danger we were in. Then one night I heard a noise outside my window. I peeked through the blinds and saw a group of men lurking in the shadows. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized they had found us. I rushed to wake up Mark, but it was too late. The men burst through the door, guns drawn, shouting threats. I froze, unable to move as they searched the apartment, tearing it apart in their search for Mark, but he was nowhere to be found. Somehow he had managed to slip away in the chaos, leaving me alone to face the consequences. The men left empty-handed, but I knew they would be back. I packed a bag and fled the apartment, not knowing where to go or what to do. I was scared and alone with nowhere to turn for help, but I knew one thing for certain: I would never trust the stranger again. I thought I got a great deal on the used phone. It was a sleek model, barely a year old, and the price was too good to pass up. I bought it from a guy who seemed friendly enough. He told me he was upgrading and didn't need it anymore. I didn't think twice about it. The first couple of days everything was fine. I set up my apps, transferred my contacts, and got used to the new features, but then late one night I received a text from an unknown number. It said, "Where's the money?" I assumed it was a wrong number and ignored it. The messages kept coming, each one more aggressive than the last. "You can't hide forever," one said. Another read, "We know who you are." My heart pounded every time my phone buzzed. I finally replied, telling them they had the wrong person. The response was immediate and chilling: "We know you. Have the phone, bring the money, or else." I felt a cold sweat break out. I tried to call the guy who sold me the phone, but his number was disconnected. Panic set in. I didn't know what to do. I went to the police, but they said without more information there wasn't much they could do. They advised me to change my number. That night I decided to turn off the phone and get a new number in the morning. I tried to sleep, but every noise outside made me jump. Around midnight I heard a loud bang on my front door. My blood ran cold. I crept to the window and peeked out. There were two men standing on my porch, looking angry and impatient. I backed away, my heart racing. I didn't know what to do. Then my phone buzzed again. I had forgotten to turn it off. The message said, "Open the door or we'll break it down." I felt trapped. I considered calling the police rellas again, but I was too scared to make any noise. The banging continued. I knew I couldn't stay silent forever. I grabbed the phone and texted back, "I don't have your money. I just bought this phone." There was a long pause, then a reply, "Prove it." I frantically searched for the receipt from the guy who sold it to me, but I couldn't find it. I sent another message, "Please, I swear I'm telling the truth." The banging stopped, but I could hear them talking outside. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it didn't sound good. Then another message came through, "You have 1 hour to find the money or we'll be back." They left, but I knew they weren't bluffing. I spent the next hour trying to think of what to do. I decided to go to a friend's house and figure things out from there. I crapped a few things, including the phone, and slipped out the back I kept looking over my shoulder expecting to see those men following me. When I got to my friend's place, I explained everything. She was shocked and let me stay the night the next morning. We went back to my house to get more of my things. The front door had been kicked in, and the place was trashed. They had been looking for something and it wasn't there. I called the police again, and this time they took it seriously. They found fingerprints and other evidence, but the men were long gone. They told me to stay with my friend while they investigated. I changed my number and got a new phone, but I was still scared every time attacks came through. I jumped. Weeks passed and the police didn't find the men. I moved to a new apartment and tried to put it behind me, but the fear stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that they might find me again. Every time I heard a knock on the door, my heart skipped a beat. The ordeal changed me. I used to feel safe in my own home, but now I always felt like I was being watched. I had owned that old boat for years, but it was time to let it go. Living in Minneapolis, I figured someone would appreciate it more, so I put it up for sale. It didn't take long for someone to show interest. A guy named Dave contacted me, saying he wanted to buy it. He seemed nice enough and we agreed on a price. We met at the marina where I tapped the boat. Dave inspected it, asked a few questions, and then handed me the cash. Everything seemed legit. I felt a little sad watching him sail away, but also relieved to have the money. I thought that was the end of it. A week later, I got a call from Dave. He said there was an issue with the boat's paperwork and asked if we could meet to sort it out. I didn't see any harm in it, so we arranged to meet at a diner near the marina. When I arrived, Dave was already there, but he wasn't alone. Another guy was with him, a tough-looking man who didn't say much. Dave started talking about some missing documents and asked if I had them. I was confused because I gave him everything when he bought the boat. He then mentioned something about needing to access a specific compartment on the boat that required my help. I didn't understand what he meant, but I agreed to go with him to check it out. When we got to the marina, it was pretty deserted. We walked to the boat and Dave pointed out a small hatch I'd never really noticed before. He insisted there was something important in there that needed my attention. As I started to open it, the tough guy grabbed me and shoved me into the cabin. I was stunned and tried to fight back, but he was much stronger. They tied me up and started searching the boat frantically. I kept asking what was going on, but they ignored me. After what felt like hours, they found a hidden compartment stuffed with packages. That's when it hit me: drugs. Dave looked at me with a mix of anger and desperation. He accused me of trying to double-cross him, saying I knew about the drugs all along. I had no idea what he was talking about. I bought the boat years ago from an old friend and never imagined anything like this. They argued about what to do with me. The tough guy wanted to get rid of me, but Dave wasn't so sure. They decided to keep me tied up. While they figured it out, they left me alone in the cabin, but I could hear them talking outside. They were planning to use the boat to transport the drugs and didn't want any loose ends. My heart was pounding. I knew I had to get out of there. I managed to wiggle my hands free and started looking for something to use as a weapon. I found a rusty old knife and quietly made my way to the deck. The two of them were still arguing and I saw my chance. I snuck up behind the tough guy and jabbed the knife into his leg. He screamed and fell, giving me a split second to run. Dave tried to grab me, but I was quicker. I ran down the dock. Now looking back, my only thought was to get to safety. I made it to my car and drove straight to the police station. I told them everything. At first they seemed skeptical, but when I described the boat and the drugs, they took me seriously. They sent officers to the marina, but by the time they got there, Dave and the tough guy were gone. The boat was still there with the drugs inside. The police launched an investigation and I spent hours answering questions. They eventually found out that the boat had been used by a smuggling ring before I bought it. The drugs were hidden so well that I never knew they were there. Dave and his partner were part of that ring and thought I was trying to cheat them. The police put me in protective custody for a while in case they came after me. I moved to a new place and changed my routines constantly, looking over my shoulder. It took months before I started to feel somewhat safe again. Looking back, I realized how close I came to losing everything. Selling that boat seemed like a simple transaction, but it nearly cost me my life. I love collecting antiques, so when I saw the set of antique dishes at a flea market in San Diego, I couldn't resist. The man selling them looked ordinary, dressed in jeans and a baseball Cappy told me the dishes were from the early 1900s and the price seemed reasonable. I paid him in cash and took the dishes home. At home, I carefully unpacked the dishes. They were beautiful with intricate patterns and a slightly worn look that added to their charm. I decided to do some research to find out more about their history. I found similar patterns online, but nothing exactly like mine. That made them seem even more special. A few days later, I received an email from a local antiques forum where I had posted a picture of the dishes. The message was from a woman named Claire. She claimed the dishes were stolen from her grandmother's house a few weeks ago. She asked me to meet her to discuss it. I felt uneasy but decided to meet her at a nearby cafe. Zil was in her late 30s with short blonde hair and a serious expression. She showed me a photo of her grandmother's dining room, and there were my dishes on the table. She pleaded with me to return them, saying they were family heirlooms. I agreed to return the dishes, feeling bad for Sil and her grandmother. We arranged for me to drop them off at her house the next day. That evening, I packed the dishes back into the box, feeling a mix of regret and relief. The next morning, as I was about to leave, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find the man from the flea market standing there holding a gun. He pushed his way inside, closing the door behind him. My heart raced as he demanded the dishes back. I told him I was returning them to their rightful owner, but he didn't care. He tied me up and searched my apartment until he found the box with the dishes. He seemed desperate, muttering to himself as he packed them back up. I tried to stay calm, hoping he would just take the dishes and leave. Instead, he started questioning me about Claire. How did I know her? What did she tell me? I explained the situation, but he didn't believe me. He accused me of being part of some scheme to take the dishes from him. I had no idea what he was talking about. He demanded I call CLA and arrange another meeting. I hesitated, but he waved the gun in my face, and I had no choice. I called Claire, trying to sound normal, and asked if I could bring the dishes over later that day. She agreed, and I hung up, praying she wouldn't be there. When we arrived, the man forced me into my own car, keeping the gun trained on me as he drove. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. The streets of San Diego blurred as we headed towards Claire's address. When we arrived, he shoved me out of the car and told me to act natural. Cia opened the door, surprised to see me with a man. She looked from into me, sensing something was wrong. I tried to signal her with my eyes, but it was too late. The man pushed past me, grabbing Cia and dragging her inside. He demanded to know where the rest of the stolen items were. Cia cried, saying she didn't know what he was talking about. I realized then that this man must have stolen more than just the dishes, and thought Claire had something to do with it. As he ransacked the house, I managed to free my hands from the rope. I found a heavy vase on a nearby table and crept up behind him. Just as he was about to strike Cia, I smashed the vase over his head. He fell to the floor unconscious. Claire and I tied him up and called the police. They arrived quickly and took him into custody. It turned out he was part of a larger theft ring, and the police had been looking for him for months. They were grateful for our help in capturing him. Claire got her dishes back and we became friends. After the ordeal, I was shaken but grateful to be. But I've always been handy with tools, so I decided to start my own handyman service in Houston. I listed my services online, hoping to get some extra income. It didn't take long before I got a call from a guy named Mr. Reynolds. He said he had a few odd jobs around his house and needed someone to come by when I got to the address. It was a big house in a quiet neighborhood. Mr. Reynolds was an older man, maybe in his late 50s. With a friendly smile, he greeted me at the door and invited me in. He showed me a few things that needed fixing: a leaky faucet, a loose door knob, and a squeaky floorboard. I got to work right away. Everything seemed normal at first. Mr. Reynolds was pleasant, offering me coffee and chatting about mundane things. But after a while, I noticed he was watching me a bit too closely. It made me uneasy, but I brushed it off, thinking he was just particular about his house. As I was fixing the floorboard, he suddenly stood right behind me. I turned around, startled, and he hit me on the head with something heavy. Everything went black. When I came to, I was tied to a chair in a dimly lit basement. My head throbbed and I felt disoriented. Mr. Reynolds was standing in front of me, no longer smiling. He looked menacing, a stark Contrast to the friendly man I had met earlier, he told me he needed money and that I was his ticket to getting it. He was going to hold me for ransom, he said, and if I cooperated I wouldn't get hurt. Panic set in. I told him I didn't have much money, but he didn't care. He was planning to contact my family or anyone who might pay for my release. I tried to reason with him, but he wouldn't listen. He tagged me and left a basement, locking the door behind him. I was alone, tied up and terrified. I had to find a way out. I struggled against the ropes, but they were too tight. The basement was cold and damp with a faint smell of mold. I looked around trying to find something I could use to free myself. There was a rusty nail sticking out of one of the beams nearby. If I could just reach it, I managed to tip the chair over, landing hard on my side. The pain was intense, but I ignored it and focused on the nail. It took a lot of effort, but I finally managed to cut through the ropes. My hands were raw and bleeding, but I was free. I got up slowly, trying to be as quiet as possible. I needed to find a way out of the basement. There was a small window up on one wall, but it was too small to climb through. The only way out was the door Mr. Reynolds had locked. I searched the basement for anything I could use as a weapon. There was a broken pipe on the floor, heavy and jagged. I picked it up and crept towards the door. I had to be ready if he came back. Our past, or maybe it was just minutes. Time seemed to stretch in that dark, cold basement. Finally, I heard footsteps upstairs. The door creaked open and Mr. Reynolds walked in holding a phone. He didn't see me at first. I was hiding behind some old boxes. As he stepped further into the basement, I took a deep breath and swam the pipe with all my strength. It hit him in the back and he fell forward, dropping the phone. I didn't wait to see if he was unconscious. I ran up the stairs, my AR pounding. I burst out of the basement and into the main part of the house. I could see the front door, but I heard Mr. Reynolds groaning behind me. I ran to the door, fumbling with the lock, and finally managed to get it open. I sprinted down the street, not looking back. I found a neighbor's house and banged on the door until someone answered. They called the police, and I was finally safe. The police arrived and arrested Mr. Reynolds. It turned out he had done this before, targeting handymen and other workers who came to his house. I was lucky to get out alive. Now I'm more cautious about the jobs I take. I have always loved vintage dresses. They were my passion, my hobby, and I had collected them for years. My closet was full of beautiful, unique pieces from different eras, but I needed the money, so I decided to sell my collection. I put an ad online and soon got a response from a man named Daniel. He seemed polite and very interested in buying the whole collection. Daniel came to my apartment in Nashville to look at the dresses. He was about my age, in his early 30s, with a clean-cut appearance and an easy smile. He complimented my taste and seemed genuinely fascinated by each dress. We chatted for a bit and he asked a lot of questions about where I found them, what my favorite pieces were, and if I had more. It felt like talking to a fellow enthusiast, and I didn't think much of it. After a while, he decided to buy several of the dresses. He paid him cash and left with his purchases. I felt a mix of sadness and relief as I watched him walk away. It was hard parting with my beloved dresses, but I needed the money more. A few days later, I started noticing Daniel around my neighborhood. At first I thought it was a coincidence, maybe he lived nearby or worked in the area, but then I saw him more frequently. He was always just a little too close for comfort, always glancing my way with that same polite smile. One evening as I was leaving my apartment, I found Daniel standing across the street. He didn't say anything, just watched as I got into my car. My skin crawled, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just passing by, I told myself. The next day I saw him again at the grocery store. He was in the same aisle, casually browsing, but his eyes were on me. I hurried through my shopping and laughed as quickly as I could. My heart was pounding and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. That night I heard noises outside my apartment, footsteps, a rustling sound, and then a soft knock on my door. I froze, listening. The knock came again, a little louder this time. I crept to the door and peered through the peephole. Daniel was standing there, his expression calm and patient. He knocked again and my heart raised. I didn't know what to do. My mind was a whirl of fear and confusion. Why was he here? What did he want? I didn't open the door. Instead, I backed away, slowly praying he would leave. After a few minutes, he finally did. But I couldn't sleep that night. I kept hearing his knocks in my head. The following days were a blur of anxiety everywhere I went. I saw Daniel at the coffee shop, the park, even my workplace. It was like he was always one step behind me, always watching. I started to feel trapped, unable to escape his gaze. I went to the police, but they didn't take me seriously. Without any direct threats or violence, there wasn't much they could do. They advised me to be cautious and call if anything happened. I felt helpless and alone. One evening I came home to find my apartment doors slightly ajar. Panic set, and as I pushed the door open and stepped inside, the place looked untouched, but I knew something was wrong. I checked every room, my hand shaking, but found nothing out of place. Then I saw it on my bed was one of my vintage dresses, the ones Daniel had bought. He had been in my apartment. He had it key. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived there was no sign of him. They took my statement, but there was little they could do without any solid evidence. I changed the locks and stayed with a friend for a few days, but the fear didn't go away. I felt like a prisoner in my own life, always looking over my shoulder, always wondering when he would show up next. One night, I heard a noise outside my friend's house. I looked out the window and saw Daniel standing in the yard staring up at me. That was the last straw. I knew I couldn't live like this anymore. I packed my things and decided to leave Nashville. It was the only way to escape him. I moved to a new city, changed my number, and tried to rebuild my life. I always wanted a classic car. It was a dream of mine for years. So when I found one for sale in Philadelphia, I jumped at the chance. It was a 1967 Mustang in pretty good shape, and the price was reasonable. The seller, a guy named Mike, seemed nice enough. He was eager to sell and told me he needed the money quickly. I didn't ask too many questions. I met Mike at a rundown garage on the outskirts of town. The place looked abandoned, but the Mustang was there, cleaning under a layer of dust. We made the deal, and he handed over the keys. I drove the car home feeling like I had just scored the deal of it lifetime. The first sign of trouble came the next day. I was at a red light when black SUV pulled up beside me. The window rolled down and a guy inside stared at me hard. I looked away, trying to ignore him, but I could feel his eyes burning into me. The light turned green and I drove off quickly, but the SUV followed me for several blocks before finally turning away. That night I heard noises outside my house. It sounded like someone was messing with the car. I crapped a flashlight and went to check, but by the time I got outside no one was there. The car was fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A few days later I was driving to work when the SUV appeared again. This time it was right on my tail. I tried to lose them weaving through traffic, but they stayed with me. Finally I pulled into a crowded parking lot and ran inside a store, hoping they wouldn't follow. They didn't, but when I came back out there was a note on my windshield. It said, "We know who you are." I decided to call Mike. His phone went straight to voicemail. I tried a few more times, but no luck. I started to get really worried. That evening I noticed the SUV parked down the street from my house. They were watching me. The next morning I found my tires slashed. I called a tow truck and had the car taken to a nearby garage. The mechanic told me it would take a few days to get new tires and fix some other minor issues. I felt a bit of relief, thinking maybe things would calm down without the car around, but that night someone broke into my house. I woke up to the sound of shattering glass and footsteps downstairs. I grabbed a baseball bat and crept down the stairs, heart pounding. There were two men in my living room rummaging through my stuff. They saw me and one of them lunged. I swung the bat, hitting him in the side. He went down, but the other I pulled a knife. I backed up, trying to keep the bat between us. He slashed at me and I felt a sharp pain in my arm. I swung the bat again, hitting his arm and knocking the knife away. He tackled me and we both went down hard. I managed to get on top of him and hit him again until he stopped moving. I grabbed my phone and called the police. They arrived within minutes and arrested the two men. I was taken to the hospital where I got stitches for the cut on my arm. The police questioned me about the men, but I didn't know anything. They took my statement and promised to look into it. A few days later, I got a call from a detective. He told me that the men who broke into my house were part of a gang and they were looking for something they thought Mike had left in the car. He wouldn't say what, but it sounded serious. The detective advised me to stay somewhere safe until they could sort things I stayed with a friend for a while hoping the police would catch the rest of the gang. They kept the Mustang as evidence, which was fine by me. I didn't want anything to do with it anymore. Eventually the police busted the gang and things started to come down. They returned the car, but I sold it as soon as I could. I didn't want any more trouble. I saw a beautiful old piano for sale in a small shop in Las Vegas. I couldn't resist. It was a grand piano with a rich dark finish and ivory keys that felt smooth under my fingers. The shop owner said it had a history, once owned by someone famous, but he didn't say much more. I didn't care about the history, I just wanted the piano. I had the piano delivered to my apartment the next day. It fit perfectly in my living room and I spent hours playing it, losing myself and the music. It wasn't until a week later that things started to get strange. One evening I came home from work and found my front door slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it. I stepped inside cautiously. Nothing seemed out of place but the piano that was open. I never left it open. I felt a chill but dismissed it, thinking I must have forgotten. That night I woke up to the sound of someone playing the piano. The notes were soft, almost ghostly. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the living room, but no one was there. The piano was closed. I stood there, heart pounding, convinced I was losing my mind. The next morning I found a note on my doorstep. It said, "We know you have it. Return it or else." I had no idea what it meant, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was about the piano. I called the shop owner, but his number was disconnected. I went to the shop, but it was closed. The windows boarded up. That evening 2 men showed up at my door. They were dressed in dark suits and looked serious. One of them showed me a photo of the piano and asked if I had it. I lied and said no, but they didn't believe me. They pushed past me and searched my apartment. When they saw the piano, one of them smiled. "You have something that belongs to us," he said. "We need it back." I tried to explain that I bought it from the shop, but they didn't care. They insisted that the piano once belonged to a notorious mobster and that it had something valuable hidden inside. They demanded I let them take it, but I refused. It was my piano and I wasn't going to give it up. The men left, but they made it clear they would be back. I was terrified. I couldn't sleep that night, jumping at every sound. The next day I went to the police, but they said there wasn't much they could do without more information. I felt helpless. A few nights later I woke up to find the men in my apartment again. This time they weren't alone. They had brought tools and were determined to take the piano apart. I tried to stop them, but one of them grabbed me and held me back. They dismantled the piano piece by piece, but they didn't find anything. Frustrated, they turned their attention to me. They demanded to know where the hidden item was. I had no idea what they were talking about. They didn't believe me. One of them pulled out a knife and I thought that was the end. Just then there was a loud knock on the door. The men froze. The knocking grew louder, more urgent. They exchanged glances and then fled out the back door, leaving me shaken and alone. I ran to the door and opened it to find a neighbor concerned about the noise. I was too scared to explain and just thanked him. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived, the men were long gone. The police took my statement and promised to keep an eye on my apartment. They suggested I stay somewhere else for a while, but I had nowhere else to go. I was too scared to stay, but I didn't want to leave my home. A few days later I received another note. It said, "Last chance, give it back or you'll regret it." I decided I couldn't stay any longer. I packed a bag and left town, staying with a friend in another city.